This environmental group called Madre Brava did a media analysis from 2020 to 2022 in the US and I think a few countries in Europe. And they looked at what percent of news articles about climate change mention meat or livestock. And what they found is that it was less than 0.5%, even though this is accounting for about 15 to 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. I think a lot of it starts with just more attention on the issue. It's such a neglected topic. And then I think with more attention and basic understanding, that can then pave a way for more political efforts to reform laws and regulations so that we can get out of this agricultural exceptionalism paradigm that we're in.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Kenny Torrella. Kenny is a senior reporter at Vox, where he investigates the meat and dairy industry, their political power, their lobbying impacts, and their relationships to environmental NGOs around the world. This is an astonishing episode. The stats and figures of how animal agriculture has inserted itself into policy, how it's driven narratives, weaponized very similar propaganda campaigns to big oil, and yet somehow the fact that it's still not widely discussed is really incredible, and Kenny lays it all out for us, explaining how all of this amounts to what we can call agricultural exceptionalism. That the animal agriculture industry gets away with practices that would be illegal in any other sector. Kenny explains how it's just a handful of multinational corporations that are driving this destruction around the world, and that everything we see in the supermarket is the illusion of choice due to brand diversification, even though they're all owned by the same company. And the scale of the damage these companies are causing is off the charts. Whether it's the lost sequestration potential of forests due to deforestation, or the fact that animal agriculture is the number one cause of air and water pollution, freshwater use, and the use of habitable land. There are some moments of hope in the episode, though. Kenny points to both the Netherlands and Denmark, who are both being really innovative when it comes to the policies and laws that they're passing to try and shift the entire populace away from animal agriculture. However, this is being done in the background while the EU is trying to undermine the plant-based food industry, and so we discussed that at length. But while these hopeful examples do exist, they are of course rare, and for the moment, the fight against the animal agriculture industry is, as Kenny explains, politically homeless. The industry has bipartisan support in the United States, in Europe, in most individual governments around the world, and is growing every year because the American diet is the aspiration for developing economies around the world. And these corporations have so much political clout that they are exporting their factory farm model elsewhere. Kenny also explains just how devastating this model is to animals, how their welfare is stripped away, how their rights are stripped away, how they are subject to abject cruelty in this industry, and the cognitive dissonance that plays out, given that treating any other kind of animal that way would amount to an immediate prison sentence in most countries on Earth. This is a really frightening analysis of the power of the animal agricultural industry, of the impact on the planet's health, on the animals' health, and on our health. And yet, because this movement is politically homeless, it means it has not yet been politicized. So, as Kenny points out, there is still a huge amount of hope for change. And we can look to Denmark, we can look to the Netherlands, and we can look to other groups who are organizing to change our food systems so they can benefit all stakeholders: people, planet, and the animals. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Kenny, thank you so much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Rachel.
My first question for you is, why is the world in crisis?
Well, at Vox, I focus on the meat and dairy industries, both in the US and globally. And I think for anyone who follows these issues, it's kind of an ever-present crisis that is growing and growing, but receives very little attention for just how big it is. So to give listeners a sense of the scope of livestock production, each year, the world raises and slaughters about 80 billion land animals. And on top of that, about 1 to 2 trillion aquatic animals are caught from the ocean or raised on fish farms. And taken together, it's one of the largest environmental threats. It accounts for around 15 to 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The number one cause of deforestation. It's a leading cause of air and water pollution, but it's also a significant use of our resources. It's a major source of freshwater depletion, and also uses about 1/3 of habitable land. So kind of any way you look at it, there's kind of a crisis going on in the sense of animal welfare. Most of these animals are raised on factory farms. When you look at the environmental footprint, it's not only a major part of the climate crisis, but it also has a major ecological toll. And then it's getting very little attention from the media, from policymakers, from NGOs. And, you can look at the issue of fossil fuels and see some bright spots. You can see renewables are growing in many parts of the world. But when it comes to animal agriculture, pretty much meat consumption is either stable or rapidly increasing around the world. So I really try to shed light on this issue, try to get people thinking more about it, and put forward solutions to try to kind of get a hold of our meat problem and its impact on the environment and animals.
It really is quite astonishing. The guest before you, Sailesh Rao, is a systems engineer and the director of a nonprofit about climate health, essentially. And he says the animal agriculture industry is the number one driver also of climate change, that if you factor in the deforestation and the amount of potential carbon sequestration lost, then his models show that it's up to about 87% driving of emissions and of climate change more generally. So it really is quite incredible. And I think thinking about it and the cognitive dissonance of, governments and the private industry throwing millions, if not billions, at solutions like carbon capture storage, which just don't work. And we know that they don't work. We're still cutting down trees and raising forests and destroying soils, which are our natural carbon sinks. So why is it that you think, even though there's this kind of cow in the room with regards to what we could be quite naturally protecting and drawing down from the earth, why is it that cow is not being addressed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first, I just wanted to address what you mentioned in the beginning that I think is really critical to this conversation. So it's important to bring it up at the beginning, but it's kind of nuanced. I'm not familiar with his exact model, but the idea here is called the carbon opportunity cost of meat, and it's significant land use. It's the number one use of land in the world. And the idea here is that if we didn't use so much land for meat production and grew more plant-based foods, which require less land use, we could free up a lot of that land to just be reforested, to remain as natural ecosystems, which draw down a significant amount of carbon dioxide into the soil and forest land. Well, I'm not familiar with his model. I think it just goes to show that agriculture is such a distinctive form of environmental destruction in the sense that because it is so land intensive, we forego so much carbon sequestration opportunity by using so much of our land for meat and dairy rather than plant-based foods. And why is it the case that such little effort has been put into tackling this problem? I think there are so many answers to that, so be patient with me. I think part of it is cultural. If you grow up in a rich or middle income country, you grow up eating lots of meat and dairy. And that's reinforced through advertising. It's reinforced through cultural norms by these ideas that we must eat lots of meat to either be manly or to be prosperous. It's also reinforced, I think, in many ways by the meat industry itself. Over the last century, factory farms have come to really dominate, and yet the industry has been incredibly skillful at kind of painting itself as just a kind of a humble collection of small family-owned farmers, when in reality, just a handful of multinational companies control any given market, for whether it's chicken or beef or dairy or pork. So I also think there is this very powerful narrative that we must support farmers no matter what. They are the original stewards of the land, as a lot of meat companies like to describe them as. And I think surely there are many exceptions in which farmers are trying to do the right thing, trying to have a lighter ecological footprint. But the vast majority of farmers are in a system in which they have little choice but to use practices that pollute the environment, that abuse animals in order to turn a profit. And not only has the industry been incredibly skillful at creating this narrative for the general public, but also for policymakers. Proportional to their revenue, just as an example, Tyson gives more of its money to politicians than ExxonMobil. There was an analysis done of this a few years ago. Again, that's proportional to their revenue. Tyson is a smaller company than ExxonMobil. But the meat and dairy industries have been incredibly politically powerful by just throwing a lot of money at lawmakers. And in doing so, they've also been able to exempt themselves from a host of regulations. It's this concept called agricultural exceptionalism, in which agriculture has become exempt from just basic water and air pollution laws here in the United States and elsewhere, from basic labor laws, from basic animal welfare laws. So that has also made the price of meat really cheap. And I think that's hard for consumers to resist. Especially in a time of rising inflation. So I think there's a whole host of factors, economic, political, and cultural, that prevent us from not only talking about this problem honestly, but also addressing it in the ways that climate scientists say we must, which really comes down to just reducing the amount of meat and dairy we produce and consume and switching to a more plant-based food system.
Quite extraordinary fact there that Tyson, and I assume that's one of these multinationals, gives more money relatively to politicians than ExxonMobil. And even that, it's amazing. Like, I can name the private big oil companies and I can name, the state-owned oil companies. I cannot name a single multinational animal agriculture company, despite the impact that they are having on the planet. Which is, this is the thing, I think a lot of people are kind of vaguely aware. It's sort of there in the background, but the picture, what am I trying to say? It's not that the picture hasn't been painted clearly. It's almost like it's too difficult to look at almost and really begin to grasp it, or maybe we can't sort of handle our attention diverted, to oil and to animal ag at the same time, even though, as you're sort of explaining, they are using this very similar playbooks of, propaganda, whipping up political relationships, demanding exception, demanding subsidies as well. So it's very similar to the big oil playbook.
It is. And I think one really interesting part of this playbook that I think has also been really effective has been bringing in environmental NGOs into the fold. So some of the largest meat and dairy companies and trade groups have partnered with leading environmental NGOs on what many critics describe as greenwashing projects. And, there's a spectrum of greenwashing, and some of these groups do great work, but I think some of them have kind of crossed a line into working with meat and dairy companies in a way that is more PR than, environmental progress. I mean, just as one example, from 2017 to 2022, the World Wildlife Fund took about 12 to I think $26 million. It's not clear how much. They don't report specifically how much from some of the largest meat and dairy companies and fast food chains to work on projects that are intended to reduce the emissions and environmental footprint of animal agriculture, but there's very little proof that they have. And there's kind of some similar issues with other leading environmental NGOs as well. I did a big report looking at this relationship between the industry and some of the big NGOs. And I think that has helped industry kind of stave off criticism by saying, look, we're working with really big NGOs on this. We're figuring it out. And that's not to say that they shouldn't. I absolutely think that NGOs should collaborate with corporations on making environmental progress, but I think it has to be done transparently and progress has to be shown. But that hasn't really been the case so far.
Well, it would be one thing if NGOs were partnering with corporations in order to firm up regulatory standards from the outside and could be a third party, essentially, or representative of the environment, nature, the crisis itself. But if they're collaborating with corporations in order to spin very, very minor attempts to slightly greenify products, even though, as you say, the industry is growing every year, which means the destruction is growing every year, then that's a very different relationship.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. So Tyson Foods is the largest meat company in the United States. I think it was last year they started introducing onto the market something that they call climate-friendly beef or climate-smart beef.
Oh, geez.
And just so listeners understand, beef is the most carbon-intensive food product there is. It's kind of equivalent to like the Hummer of automobiles, or the coal of energy production. And yet in their marketing, they've really promoted that they've worked with Environmental Defense Fund and Nature Conservancy on this project. And I think that's just one of many examples. There's a leading dairy industry group that says that they're working towards net zero dairy. JBS, the largest meat company in the entire world, has said that they're, working towards net zero. And they've put out tons of advertisements.
JBS, who deforests the Amazon at an astonishing rate.
That's right. Yeah. And interestingly, in a rare case of accountability, last year, the New York State Attorney General, Letitia James, actually sued JBS and said you can't make these net zero claims because they don't stand up to scrutiny. And I think that was a promising sign of policymakers, at least one policymaker, really taking the meat industry to task on these really grandiose claims of net zero and sustainability.
God, there's so many. I just want to go in so many different directions with this. Okay. The thing that's, I want to jump back in time slightly to something you said in the answer to the first question, because it's just come to mind that this chain of propaganda around, farmers being essential, which they are, but the fact these multinational corporations are not smallhold farms, are not feeding villages, are essentially supplying other multinational corporations. What's so interesting about it is that it uses the exact same messaging of big oil, which is that this fuel that we are providing you is essential. Like food is essential, fuel is essential. If you don't have us, things will shut down. If you don't have our fuel, civilization will shut down. If you don't have our meat, everybody's going to go hungry. And also, by the way, you're going to affect really poor people who are supplying you with, this product, even though it's not them at all that is supplying it. And obviously, this essential quality behind these campaigns wouldn't really get anywhere if they weren't backed by states or by policymakers. And so this is sort of a meta question, if you will, and I apologize for it, but really, what do we do in that scenario? Even if we can sort of get past the propaganda around big oil, around big ag, thanks to journalists like yourself, I mean, if they are still fundamentally in bed with policymakers promoting, or not even promoting, but validating this propaganda, even if some of us, see through it, then really, how do we begin to sort of disempower these multinationals from the total destruction that they're profiting from?
So this is not the most exciting answer. I think it kind of begins with just like political education and understanding to kind of break through some of these false narratives. So just as another kind of surprising statistic here, this environmental group called Madre Brava did a media analysis from 2020 to 2022 in the US and I think a few countries in Europe. And they looked at what percent of news articles about climate change mention meat or livestock. And what they found is that it was less than 0.5%, even though this is accounting for about 15 to 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so
Wow.
I think a lot of it starts with just more attention on the issue. It's such a neglected topic. And then I think with more attention and basic understanding, that can then pave a way for more political efforts to reform laws and regulations so that we can get out of this, agricultural exceptionalism paradigm that we're in which most industries are regulated one way, but then agriculture is regulated in another way or just not regulated at all. So I think some of it really just has to start with basic education. Like you were saying, most people couldn't even name one or two multinational meat companies. Part of that is because when you go to the grocery store, there maybe one company is responsible for 20% of the products, but they have 5 different brand names. There's this illusion of diversification in the meat industry when really one company might own, multiple brands or dozens of brands in some cases, I think. So I also think we can look to some of the countries that are trying to make progress on this. More specifically, I would look at the Netherlands and Denmark. These are two countries that their farming system is not so different than the US or the rest of Europe in the sense that it's highly industrialized factory farm model. And they're faced with high levels of nitrogen pollution from animal manure, from nitrogen fertilizer that's applied to the corn and soy that is grown to feed the livestock. And it's the same problem here in the US, but in the US, we ignore it, we push it away, it doesn't come up in the media, it doesn't come up in Capitol Hill or in state legislatures. But they're actually talking about it. So in the Netherlands, there has been significant legislation to rein in nitrogen pollution from farming. They even have a system set up to pay farmers to stop farming their land so that they can kind of give ecosystems some time to repair. Denmark has been even more ambitious. They have set aside I believe it's around $200 million, which is a significant amount of money given that the country is just 6 million people. Some of that is set aside to pay farmers to grow more plant-based foods. So it's incentivizing farmers to do the better thing rather than to do the thing that's bad for the environment. And then they've also set aside money to give to different projects to build up the plant-based food sector by this can look like a number of different things, like working with grocers to advertise more plant-based foods or to help companies that want to create plant-based products get off the ground. And more recently, Denmark passed the world's first tax on livestock emissions.
Oh, wow.
And it's also paying farmers who reduce their nitrogen fertilizer application, because a big problem is that many farmers who grow corn and soy for livestock are over applying fertilizer, which then contaminates groundwater, waterways, and rivers. So this is kind of a long way of saying I think we can look to some countries in Scandinavia who have found themselves in a similar position as the rest of Europe, as the United States, in terms of just massive pollution from industrialized animal farming, and are now trying to steer the ship in a different direction. I think it's a long time before many other countries in Europe and before the United States go in that direction, but I think it's really inspiring to see some countries actually experiment with their policy to go in a better direction.
Interestingly, though, the EU, as a collection of governments, has been instrumental in undermining the plant-based food industry. But I think it was last year, now correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was last year that the plant-based food sector essentially lost the fight to use words like milk or meat or whatever. And that is due to the power of the animal agricultural lobby that said, no, we don't want them saying that this is milk because it comes from almonds and so it's not milk. And I mean, the devastation that caused to the sector was huge because obviously packaging had to be remade. So even just on that level, but also if you're trying to onboard citizens essentially into something that is different, then you want the first few steps to be as easy as possible. And banning the use of that language was extraordinary, especially given the EU wants to promote itself as this sort of climate-friendly regulatory, police in the world.
That's right. Yeah, we've seen this trend coming up around the world. Many U.S. states have banned plant-based companies from using terms like meat or milk on their packaging. Some of those laws have been overturned on First Amendment grounds, which is good news.
It's good.
But yeah, there's also been a fight on this at the EU level, at the country level in many EU member states. And last year, the EU was also on the cusp of banning cages for farm animals. It would have gotten hundreds of millions of animals out of cages. But at the last minute, the livestock lobby, a few trade groups, successfully stopped it. And
how?
Through their lobbying power. There's also a revolving door issue on this in many places. Just as an example, in the United States, the U.S. Department of Agriculture Secretary under President Biden, his name's Tom Vilsack. He was also the USDA secretary under Obama. But during the Trump administration, he went and worked as the CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council. So he was a dairy lobbyist for the industry for 4 years between his two terms as the agriculture secretary. And this is true kind of across different levels of management within the USDA and FDA, where there's a revolving door between industry and government. Even in the United States, many members of Congress own farmland and receive significant subsidies from the federal government. And yet at the same time, they're supposed to be regulating the government, regulating agriculture, I should say. I think these stories are kind of just the tip of the iceberg on just how ruthless and dominant the meat and dairy industries have been in policymaking, from the state level to the national level to the continent-wide level in the EU.
It's so depressing. It's so depressing.
Yeah.
I suppose, like, the only kind of good thing, I feel like every time I learn more about how rubbish everything is, the one kind of like soothing fact, I suppose, is that it's all the same thing over and over and over and over again. And so if we can figure out what to do, like how to unravel it in one place, then we will surely be able to apply that across the board, because it seems to me it's always a problem of centralizing power. And power is fuels, it's political power, and it's land. It's this marriage of politics and resources. And politics is essentially born out of discussing resources, who has what and how do we get more and whatever. But it does sometimes feel impossible, though, when you see just how deep the links go, like almost the two strands of DNA, the helix being essentially corporate power and political power. And the fact that it is political power that is meant to hold these corporations to account, especially in a place like the United States, which was essentially built on, how do we liberate the free market to drive wealth to the top, but we'll say it's for development.
I think you're right. It can be really depressing to kind of stare at this issue all day and see little progress. I think what I'm about to say, I think, is both maybe kind of depressing, but also has a glimmer of hope, in that I think people who work on this issue long enough, this issue meaning factory farming, its environmental impact, its animal welfare impact, view this as a kind of multi-century project, in the sense that maybe we talk about climate change in the course of decades. I think people who work on this issue think about it more in many, many decades or even centuries. I think what we might see is that in the coming decades, we're going to see rich and middle-income countries start to stabilize or reduce their meat production and consumption. This is maybe best case scenario. I think we can see what's happening in the Netherlands and Denmark and also Germany. Germany is the one country in the world, I believe, where meat consumption has been steadily declining over the last decade.
Oh.
And so I think there's a few countries in Europe that are going to lead on this issue. Europe, often tends to be a decade or two ahead of the rest of the world, the rest of the, highly developed world when it comes to environmental progress. And so I think it's going to take time for maybe the entire continent, the United States, Australia, and so on, to kind of catch up to what Germany and Netherlands and Denmark are doing. I think the bigger question is maybe the global picture, because a lot of low-income countries or lower middle-income countries eat just a fraction of the amount of meat and dairy that Americans and Europeans eat. And there's a lot of tension there between what the future of their food consumption looks like. And there's a similar conversation going on around, energy production. Can they make the switch to solar now, or do fossil fuels have to be a bridge to a renewable energy system? Exact same issue when it comes to meat and dairy. And I think I'm not, being a privileged, middle-class American, I'm not in a position to say, oh, people in low-income countries should eat this or eat that. I do worry, though, that we are rapidly exporting the American factory farming model overseas, which is happening in Latin America and Asia and increasingly in Africa as well. And I worry that they may be just replicating a lot of the same problems and not seeing the lessons that we've learned from this, kind of high production, highly industrialized system of animal factory farming. So the future is really unclear, I think, when it comes to lower and lower middle income countries as to just how far they'll go in replicating the European and American factory farming model.
It is totally fascinating how there is, as you said, a direct parallel between, can we ask developing economies, quote unquote developing economies, to skip a certain stage of prosperity? And I think for something like fossil fuels, there are pretty easy arguments to be made in that, if we actually have a loss and damage fund and wealth from the global north that has been extracted from the global south is redirected back to the global south in order for renewable energy, which is more, causes less pollution, causes less harm, is decentralized, yada, yada, yada. You can totally see why people would be like, yeah, no, I'm happy to skip that if you're giving it to me for free.
Yeah.
Whereas asking people to skip out on something that for millennia has been associated with wealth and status in a culture in which we're not actually addressing what it means to be wealthy and what it means to have status. It's kind of like, essentially saying, how do I put this? It's kind of like saying, yeah, Kim Kardashian still exists in the world, but we want nobody to ever want to emulate her, despite her being this, huge star. And it seems like quite a difficult task. And then I think you also get into really, really interesting conversations around what a land and a diet actually introduces to culture. And so you then have the problem of this quite colonial mindset of the white world saying to people, no, you can't have that actually. Even though it's a part of your culture, even though eating, this food like this is a part of your culture, you can't do it because we did it too much and we fucked everything up. I don't even know how you begin to have those conversations.
Yeah, it's really complicated because I think in many Asian and African countries, plant-based foods, particularly different kinds of legumes, and especially in parts of East Asia, tofu, have been staples of the diet, and diets have generally been low meat, simply out of resource efficiency. Meat requires a lot more resources, a lot more water, a lot more land. and also a lot more fossil fuels to
Yeah.
grow, to develop the nitrogen fertilizer that's applied to crops. And so by nature, a lot of countries have had kind of a middle amount of meat and dairy in their diets. But over the last few decades, due to globalization, kind of the American diet, the European diet has become this aspiration. And with that, you see the export not just of American style factory farming, but also American fast food chains. And to supply those restaurants, you need factory farms. So it's really complex. I don't have all the answers, but I do think that American food companies have absolutely viewed kind of low and middle income countries as kind of the next phase of their business plan, because American meat consumption has more or less stabilized over the last decade or two.
Right.
It's increased a little bit. So then the question becomes, well, where can we export to? And at the same time, it's understandable that people would want to eat more meat, given that it's viewed as this status measure, and also that it just tastes good. But yeah, I worry that those kind of narrative forces and economic forces will kind of entrench factory farming in places where it currently doesn't have much of a foothold.
It's so amazing that the American diet is the aspiration, or even the European one, although I can say as a European, it's all very mixed over here.
Yeah.
Because if you, like, the United States has some of the unhealthiest people in the world, rates of cardiac disease, heart disease, all of these are through the roof. And so the amount of propaganda that must be going in to sell this abroad, essentially, as the thing to aspire to, is astonishing, because you would think that anybody would look at the United States and be like, okay, even if you're the kind of person that goes, I want the big car, I want the big house, I want to be able to consume, but I don't want to die at 72, due to being overweight. It's crazy.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes back to the kind of the power of storytelling, and that comes back to a lot of the power of advertising, in that food companies who work very closely with meat producers have developed these products that in many ways, as we know, are kind of irresistible, given that they're so high in sodium or fat or sugar. And combined with this kind of aspirational idea that this is what we want to be eating, has been kind of really difficult to combat, I think, in the United States. I think it's why there is some kind of strange kind of coalition building around RFK Jr.'s Make America Healthy Again movement. I think some health and environmental NGOs have found themselves in a weird position where they're like, I think RFK Jr.'s positions on vaccines are absolutely bonkers, and yet he has some good ideas, maybe not very workable, but some good ideas around problems with our food system. Or he's at least identified and been able to speak about the problems in our food system in a way that connects to Republicans. I do find it funny, though, that because just, 15 years ago, Michelle Obama was making a lot of the same points, and Republicans hated her for it. She was really trying to say, let's eat healthier, let's make school food healthier. And there was uproar. But as soon as, a MAGA type figure is saying it, people seem open-minded to it. So it's a very strange time for American politics, and it's going to be really interesting to see what the next 4 years look like for the food industry and agriculture.
I think that poses a really interesting question, because if you look at Trump, he is the big oil candidate. He is totally against the energy transition. He's against anything to do with China, renewable energy. And he is quite obviously going to throw a whole bunch of environmental regulations just sort of off the side of the sinking ship. However, he did sort of court RFK and bring him on side. And so if the animal agriculture is as big a political power as you say, then there's going to be some real tension perhaps between corporations and government. And it would be interesting to see who gets the chop.
Yeah,
Pardon the pun.
yeah, there's been a lot of speculation as to just how much power he'll be able to have in reforming food policy. As if he is confirmed as the head of HHS, Human Health Services, he will have oversight over the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, which oversees just part of the food system. Part of the animal industries, just milk and I believe eggs. Whereas the U.S. Department of Agriculture oversees red meat and poultry,
Oh, I see.
and really the bulk. It's this weird system where we've split things up. It doesn't quite make much sense. So, yeah, RFK Jr., if he is confirmed, he will have some oversight of animal agriculture, but most of that will be under the responsibility of the U.S. Department of Agriculture Secretary, and Trump nominated someone named Brooke Rollins, and it's really interesting. She doesn't have much background in agriculture. She grew up on a farm, and I think she got a degree in agricultural development. But otherwise, most of her career has been dedicated to working in kind of right-wing think tanks. I think she'll kind of be a more of the same agriculture secretary, because she doesn't have a history of being progressive on ag issues, and kind of the status quo under both Republican and Democratic administrations is that we just continue to exempt the meat and dairy industries from critical regulations, and we throw a ridiculous amount of subsidies, both through direct payments, through crop insurance, through research and development, at the meat and dairy industry. So my best bet is that things are going to be pretty much status quo over the next 4 years.
It's so interesting how this is a non-partisan issue, essentially, around the world, while the other major pollers are kind of getting cut down left and right. But it does show that there's potential here because it's not yet been a politicized issue.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a lot of people who work on this issue are kind of split as to how to approach it. There's some people who think, look, we really need to just persuade liberals and Democrats to be on our side. And if that means it's further politicized, that's okay. We at least need one political party to be on our side, because right now, neither are. And then some say, no, we really need to build a big tent. There are certainly some Republicans who care about animal welfare, who are concerned about environmental pollution, because most of this pollution is in rural areas where the factory farms are, affecting rural communities. Their water, their air. So currently, people kind of describe the anti-factory farming movement, the animal rights movement, as politically homeless. I don't know what's going to happen over the next 4 years, over the next 10, 15 years. Right now, it's kind of a bipartisan issue, as you mentioned, to both support the meat industry, to kind of criticize the organizations trying to reform it. But there are certainly people on both sides of the aisle who want to see a change, and people on both sides of the aisle who keep the status quo humming along. I think the political part of this is massive. I think it has been a bit confusing as to why Democrats and liberals in the United States, and I think that generally translates to Europe, maybe with the exception of some of the Green parties in Europe, have been very progressive on these issues. But in the US, I think a lot of it maybe comes down to more farm state versus non-farm state, because you can have kind of farm state Democrats like Tim Walz, who was Kamala Harris's VP pick. He's the governor of Minnesota, which is one of the biggest meat producing states in the country. His policy record has been very pro factory farming, and yet he otherwise kind of codes as this kind of progressive, moderate progressive politician. On the other hand, there are some Republican politicians. I'll use one example as Mike Lee in Utah. He's pretty far right, but Utah isn't that big of a meat producing state, and he's taken some progressive stances on the factory farming and animal welfare issues. So it's an issue where there's a lot of kind of strange contradictions and surprises, which makes it really interesting and sometimes difficult to report on.
God, really, really interesting to report on. And as you're saying, sort of lots of potential, lots of different like holes for people either to fall through or burst through, really. I think we would be remiss in, an episode about animal agriculture to also not talk about animal welfare, which you have mentioned throughout. But
yeah,
I mean, I know that there are different laws around the world, and I know that out of sort of, again, quote unquote, developed economies, the United States is particularly bad for animal welfare. But if you have any kind of figures or stories off the top of your head to really paint a picture for how violent this industry is, I think both I and the listeners would be very grateful.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if they'll be grateful, but they'll learn something,
necessary.
I hope. Yeah. So to give a sense of the treatment of animals in factory farms, first in the United States, all of the federal animal welfare laws exempt farm animals. So the Animal Welfare Act, the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, the main transportation law as to how animals are transported.
Good God.
And then at the state level, most states, they have anti-cruelty laws, but when it comes to farming, they say that as long as a practice is normal and customary in the industry, then it's permitted. And the industry is the one who kind of sets what is customary and normal.
Yeah.
So what that looks like, we can kind of look at different species. So when it comes to chickens raised for meat, which are the most widely, farmed animal on the planet because they're so small, and people have really come to think that, chicken is healthier, beef has more saturated fat. So chicken production has just skyrocketed in recent decades, not only in the US, but around the world. And I think it's around 75 billion or so, give or take, chickens raised for meat annually. And
Jesus.
The vast majority of animals are raised in factory farms where they are in these dark, massive warehouses. They pretty much never go outside, never get fresh air, step onto grass. They're overcrowded. Many of them are mutilated without any pain relief. So in the example of pigs raised for food, they will cut off the male's testicles. They will cut off their tails. They'll cut off the tails of dairy cows. In the case of egg-laying hens, they sear off their beaks because they're so tightly packed together that if they leave their beaks intact, they'll peck each other, sometimes to death.
Oh, God.
There's a lot of cannibalism in these industries because these animals are just tightly packed and stressed. There's also a lot of breeding issues. So when looking at chickens raised for meat, they have been bred to grow bigger and faster to reap more profit from each individual chicken. So just as an example, in the 1950s, it took about 70 days for a chicken to reach 3 pounds. Today, it takes about 45 days for a chicken to reach 6.5 pounds. So they are growing to be twice as big in almost half the time. And what this does is it creates a host of different health issues. So many of them, their organs and their hearts, like they can't keep up with this rapid growth. So many just die of heart attacks. They have been bred for their breasts to grow really, really big while their legs remain very small. So many of them suffer from leg injuries. I was just reading a report last night about how many chickens suffer from leg injuries. They can't walk, so then they die of dehydration or starvation because they can't reach the feeding trough or the water.
Oh, God.
And the industry knows that some percent of their animals are just going to die from disease or from injury. And they kind of bake that into their economic model. I mean, in the chicken industry, about 5 or 6% of chickens are just going to die on the farm, no matter what, mostly from disease. And it's even higher in some other industries. A couple other quick things. In the egg industry and in the pork industry, a lot of the animals are intensively confined. So in the egg industry in the United States, more than half of hens are kept in cages where they're packed in there with about five other chickens. The cage is maybe about the size of a large microwave. They're stuck in there for about a year and a half. So they never leave. For a year and a half, they're stuck in a tiny cage, can't flap their wings, can't move around much. In the case of the pork industry, breeding pigs are confined in what are called gestation crates. These are crates that are barely larger than their own bodies. And this is for the pregnant breeding pigs. There's a whole infrastructure just for breeding. So really, the one thing I like to say to people is that if you kind of go into any corner of the meat industry and look long enough, you're going to learn it's much worse than you could really have ever imagined. Mm-hmm. Corners are always cut, whether it's for animal welfare, for the environment, for human health. It's really unbelievable that we've built this factory farm system that, it's called factory farming because these animals are treated like widgets in a factory. That's often the comparison that they made, even though these are living, sentient animals, just like our cats and dogs. If you were to do any of these practices to a cat or dog in most countries, you would be arrested for animal cruelty. Mm-hmm. But, in the United States and around the world, we not only, fail to regulate these forms of animal cruelty, we celebrate it by giving these companies our money, by governments shoveling so much taxpayer money to prop them up. I mean, by one measure, the dairy industry in the United States, about half of the production cost is subsidized. I know that in Europe, a significant portion of production costs are subsidized. So it really is quite maddening. It can really kind of affect your view of humanity to say, we built the system and then we maintain it and we grow it. Surely, just on the foundation of animal suffering. It's really quite hard to imagine, a worse kind of way to feed ourselves. And yet this is what we've built.
Thank you for that, Kenny. I think it was important. I know I have to let you go. So my last question for you is, who would you like to platform?
Yeah, someone I'll platform. We talked about him earlier in a way. This guy named Rune Christopher Dragsdahl. I hope I'm saying his name right. He is the head of the Vegetarian Society of Denmark. And he is one of the main architects of all of that political change that we talked about earlier in the episode.
Brilliant.
About how Denmark is really leading the way when it comes to reforming their subsidies to more build up the plant-based food system, to try to get farmers to use more environmentally sustainable practices, to switch to more plant-based farming. And his story is really inspiring because even though he's the head of the Vegetarian Society of Denmark, he was able to build this coalition of vegetarians, of organic food enthusiasts, of livestock farmers, of livestock groups, to all come to the table with politicians and say, the system we have is not working. It's not working for animals. It's not working for the Danish people. It's not working for the animals or farmers. We need some serious reforms. And he was able, with the help of many other advocates, to push through this pretty transformative legislation, the first of its kind in the world. And it's a bit self-promotional because I just wrote a short article about him where I did a Q&A with him. So if you look up my work on Vox, you'll see one of my latest articles is a long interview with Rune Christopher. But I think to end this episode, this otherwise dark episode, on a happy note, I think what he and his colleagues are doing in Denmark should provide a lot of hope to people who are worried about factory farming and want to find real tangible solutions to making progress.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kenny.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Rachel.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.